there is this fundamental mindset that we have, I feel, within the country, and it's not restricted to the government, that people will do bad things, therefore they must be prevented from doing bad things. What that mindset leads to is making the entry conditions to doing business or to setting up a company hard, as opposed to saying, okay, we'll make it easy for you to do business, but we'll come down on you fairly hard if you break the law.
You're stuck in a bad equilibrium, it's tough to move out of it.
It is very tough, and it works for many people who are already entrenched, whether in the government side or in the private side.
This is particularly interesting because we are facing this deregulation moment, right?
I just hope that what this does is opens up avenues for people like us to make these kinds of arguments to people who are now charged with looking at deregulation top-down. What we're doing is bottom-up,
Right.
and there are people who are looking at it top-down. We'll have to find places where our minds meet somewhere.
Right.
Decriminalization of law is, what we've done so far is really a drop in the ocean.
I mean, the original report said 26,000 and they've done away with 200.
People are not thinking through what are the consequences on the minds of people who are going to enter into business of a clause like this.
One reason why they like this stuff in there, they just don't have the capacity to enforce. If they use the threat of a penal clause.
If it's an empty threat, then why should the empty threat of a penalty, a financial penalty, be worse than the empty threat of imprisonment? I would say increase the financial penalty. Why is it that we don't put people in jail for jumping a red light? We'd either have overflowing jails or non-enforcement, or a bribe being paid on the spot.
Being somebody on the road, I'll tell you what does make a difference is a camera on the traffic light.
My driver knows where the cameras are, and he slows down automatically.
Hello, thank you for joining us for another episode of Growth is Good. Today, very happy to have with us Akshay Jaitly. He's the founder of one of India's leading law firms, Trilegal, and he's focused a lot on infra and energy and power in his time in building up this law firm. Let's talk to him. The way we usually start this, now it's just happened. I never planned it like this, but I ask everyone, how did you even arrive at thinking about growth? How did you notice growth? What is your personal story related to growth, to markets, whatever it is, this broad space?
Well, I can't say that there is a very distinct personal story or journey towards growth. I'd say that it's at the time that I was growing up, not just due to familial influences, but also in terms of what the dominant thinking about what was good for the people of the country was. It's very much rooted still in the Nehruvian socialist framework. And my father, who was in government and engaged with growth on a daily basis in his job, I mean, he was very much a growth-oriented bureaucrat rather than an administration-oriented bureaucrat. But the frames of reference for that growth were very much in terms of distribution and redistribution. And in terms of the way you respond to the plight of other human beings as an individual, you respond to it in human terms. So if you see someone wanting for something, you want to give them something, or you want them to have it.
You want to solve their problems.
Yeah, exactly. You have to say, and especially as a younger person, you just say, okay, if some people have more and other people have less, then the people who have more should give, or we should take it from them and give it to the people who have less. It's just an instinctive human kind of idea. And I think for a large part of my early youth, that's what I believed in a fairly non-reflective fashion. And then I did a degree in history. My first degree was in history, which had some amount of economics in it, but it wasn't economics focused. And then my second degree was a degree in public policy, where I did a little more economics and was exposed a little more to the ideas of growth. Now, it wasn't that I wasn't exposed to them, because these are sorts of things I chat with my father, but it wasn't the focus. The focus was really on various forms of distribution, not just from rich to poor, but also between states, for example. And in fact, where we stand, where we sit today, it is one of the biggest issues
Questions, yes.
within the country at the moment.
Still very
So,
good.
so these were the kinds of. This is the way in which I engage with growth. It was the way that I've come to what I believe now, which is that growth is. You have to start with growth and then move towards things like redistribution. Is because of my experience as a practicing corporate lawyer, which is that as you sit with investors. Ultimately, our laws and the way that regulatory frameworks and the economy is set up, I think it's fairly commonly understood, and certainly since 1991, that the engine of the economy is not the government anymore. The engine of the economy is private investment. So if you want to encourage private investment, what are the circumstances within which you do so? And the circumstances within which you do so are ones in which it is easy to do business, easy to conduct business. And you see then that if you don't create conditions for growth, what you do is you have only a few large businesses which can grow because they can maneuver or manipulate or navigate, to be polite, the system. But for smaller businesses, for people who just want to set up something and grow, it's much harder to do so. And it's that those businesses, or the lack of those businesses, that are the solution of the problem for the economy. It sort of came to me by seeing the difficulties that any business had in growing and in conducting business in this country. So it's sort of a realization that was a very slow burn, which came to a head maybe even just 5-6 years ago, where I needed to then sit down and start thinking about it in slightly more theoretical terms, because otherwise, lawyers are notoriously reactive. There is a problem, a client has an issue, or either a problem, or they want to do a business, and you say, okay, here's how you do it. You don't necessarily step back and say, okay, this is the learning that I've got from 20, 25, 30 years of doing.
It's because you only get pulled in when things have already gone to hell, right?
Or when someone is starting something, but there is the framework of the problem is given to you.
Fair.
Whether it is how do I start this business, how do I build this power plant, or whether it's a dispute, of course, then that is by definition reactive. But you're not necessarily put into a situation where you're required to think of the bigger picture. And it's when I took my foot off the pedal from furiously doing transactions on a day-to-day basis that I had the chance to sort of think about what were the kinds of problems that were preventing transactions from happening more smoothly. What were the kinds of issues that I was being required to give advice on that were problems that people had to navigate? Then you started asking the question, why does this problem exist? What is the need for this approval or this permission or these submissions to be made beforehand? So that's the route that I took towards thinking about growth.
That's super interesting, and it forestalls another set of things that I was going to ask you, right? Which is having been sort of in the legal space for so long, what is your sort of overall sense of what's going wrong there or what's not going right there? And I mean, you already foreshadowed quite a lot of what you're going to say, I presume, but still, let me open that question up.
Well, just as we were just saying, there are two parts to this in terms of what could be better in the operation of law or in law making, in the implementation of law and the adjudication of law. Those are the three spaces that I tend to split things into. So if in each one of these there are different kinds of issues. I think in the making of law and the making of regulation, which is usually a subset of law in some cases, and in the making of policy, I think one of the biggest issues is the lack of involvement of the people for whom the law is being made or it's intended to serve. And I'll restrict myself to talking about the economy. I think the amount of public consultation that we have in relation to making law, the fact that there is nothing close to a cost-benefit analysis of what kinds of laws are going to be solving the problem or doing more harm than good. That kind of thing doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with law, doesn't happen with regulation, it doesn't happen with government contracts.
Right.
So you don't have enough of a sense of the degree to which the problem that you're trying to address through that process that it's likely to be solved. So that's one type of problem. The other thing, which is sort of in the implementation of it, and it sort of in a continuum from the making of law to its implementation, is that there is this fundamental mindset that we have, I feel, within the country, and it's not restricted to the government. You speak to many citizens, and they will reflect this in the same ways, often reactively, that people will do bad things, therefore they must be prevented from doing bad things. What that mindset leads to is making the entry conditions to doing business or to setting up a company hard, as opposed to saying, okay, we'll make it easy for you to do business, but we'll come down on you fairly hard if you break the law. So what we do is we don't trust ourselves to enforce the law properly. So we behave, the way we respond to that is by making it difficult for people to enter.
Right.
And that what that does is it sort of lends itself to favoring those who are already in business, and as opposed to those who want to get into business. So one of the tropes that I sort of have been repeating for many years, is that I probably know 100 people between Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, etc., who are sitting in cushy jobs, earning good salaries, who would be entrepreneurs if it remotely made sense for them to leave their comfortable lives and enter the minefield that is being an entrepreneur. So unless you're an entrepreneur in the digital space, broadly speaking, it's very hard to set up and run a business. So, and I think it's because of this attitude that people are going to do something wrong, so let's find ways to prevent them from doing it even before they've started, as opposed to implementing them. And then you get into the issue of the enforcement of law, which is talking about the court system, talking about how regulators function, and that sort of thing. And there are a bunch of things that one can be doing there as well. So that's the way that I sort of think about it.
Super interesting, and I want to, lots of fascinating stuff there. Let's start with the policy angle of it, right? And even on the implementation side, you spoke about the mindset issue, right? That the businessman is a crook, right? And you have to prevent crooks from even setting up. And then, of course, there is you said public consultations. We'll come back to that, but the idea of a cost-benefit analysis, the economics of it, how much of all of this is springing from mindsets or legacy mindsets that we have in India independently versus, let's say, some other very general human-rooted problem? We were speaking earlier about this, right? That you operate your family and your systems around you from a very different lens from how you want to operate public policy, right? And is it that it's just a fundamental human instinct to try and clamp down or run public systems differently? Or is it more this legacy system that we've inherited that, hey, businessmen are crooks?
I don't know the answer to that because, if you were to take the view that human instincts are similar across the world, you have the US, which is the opposite of us, which is that, you let people do what they want.
Right.
And then you have an extremely robust enforcement mechanism,
Right.
which will look after the fact as to whether you followed the rules or not.
Right.
So we don't quite behave like that.
And that is the most successful economic system.
So far, it is the most successful system in the world. And we, on the other hand, and I'm not being a sociologist, I won't be able to tell you whether it's because of systems of caste and going back that far, or whether it's because of colonialism and the legal framework that was set up there that largely follows. Probably all of the above.
Right.
And one was probably, the latter was probably easier because of what came before.
Right.
But that's where we are now.
Right.
So I think it requires a fundamental shift in the minds of those who make policy and who make law to think, okay, can we little by little move to a system which doesn't start off with the perspective that, okay, how do we find ways to penalize people? Sometimes even before they've started, as opposed to let people do things, let them express their humanity and their inherent freedom as human beings to do things. I have a feeling that we might be at the very beginning of this changing, because there are these moves to decriminalize laws and that sort of thing. So maybe there is a sense that this should be done, but I don't think that's a widely held view.
Right.
I think it's still something that both because ideologically people haven't quite bought into that idea, but also because instrumentally it's a way for people who are in power to continue to maintain control. I think for both reasons, we are not going to see that change in an enormous hurry. It will be little by little.
Right.
But that's where we are.
We're
So
stuck in a bad equilibrium. It's tough to move out of it.
it is very tough, and it works for many people who are already entrenched, whether in the government side or in the private side.
Yeah, absolutely. And so these forces keeping us here are very strong. We'll have to, and on the implementation side or on the enforcement, etc. side, right? That's typically the most known piece of it, right? If we have super long delays in our courts, we have so much pendency, stuff like that. You've not spoken about that as much. Is that?
I haven't a lot because for a couple of reasons. One, there are a lot of people who are doing work on that. I am not one of them. I am not working on. I have not thought about the court system all that much. Although from the research that I've looked at, that other people, including friends, have been doing, there are 2 or 3 or 4 reasons that exist, and I think what I shy away from is to say, okay, this is the problem. Because I think that if many people who invest a lot of time and effort in looking at one set of reasons for a problem tend to discount the others, and I think there's probably a whole bunch of things coming together. For instance, I mean, one of the issues is the lack of appointment of judges. But then you'll find studies which show that no, there were enough judges, but there weren't enough days when courts were open. Or then you'll have another set of studies which say, actually, it's too cheap to litigate in India. So it's very easy for the private sector to appeal something because it's the consequences to them, and they also know it's going to take a certain amount of time. So if they look at the future value of money, they'll say it's cheaper for me not to pay the money that I'm required to pay under a contract, for instance. And instead, what I'll do is I'll just pay a lawyer some fees and keep the thing going as long as possible. On the other hand, on the government side, and the government is the largest
litigant, right? That's
litigant
not
in the country.
Even cheaper for them. Right?
It is even cheaper for them, and actually it is even cheaper for them, but it is also of no consequence whether it's cheap or not.
Right, exactly.
Because there are no consequences to managers of litigation within government, so to speak, as to whether their challenge is going to be successful or not. On the private sector, you'll still do a calculus. You might still say, okay, it doesn't matter if I lose after a certain number of years, but and our courts have got slightly quicker on the commercial side of things. So you might get a private decision maker with respect to litigation say, look, it's not likely that I'm going to win, so I won't challenge.
Right.
And I'll follow some other course. That decision does not need to be taken by someone in government. So it's the incentive system within government and the fear that if you do not challenge something in a situation where the government stands to lose money,
exactly,
that if you do not follow it through, irrespective of how strong the precedents might be against
exactly,
there is no incentive for you to do so. So I think that
the calculus is the opposite. I think
it's exactly the opposite.
Right? To not litigate is always bad.
Absolutely.
And to litigate is
there is
the dominant strategy. Yeah.
So there are these a host of reasons I think that conspire to doing this.
Right. And
it's slightly different in the regulatory space, and if you want, we can speak about that separately because that's an area in which I have been involved.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute. So, and just to finish up on this, so how much, and again, you don't focus on this, but how much of these court problems, right, and court efficiency problems, therefore, in your mind, are downstream of issues that exist elsewhere? Right? So you have bad policy, you have bad regulation, you have bad incentive structures facing both public and private actors, and then you have a clogged up court system, right? And so are we just sort of looking at the symptoms of the problem?
I think to some extent we are, possibly to, in the majority we are, but there are also problems with the system itself. Some of those problems are beginning to be solved through digitization and other mechanisms. But, I'll give you an example of a situation which is purely a court-related system. There are rules that various high courts will have in relation to how long a certain process should be taken. But there is no reason, for instance, for a judge to give another date when a lawyer gets up in court and says, "I'm sorry, my lord, but I have a personal difficulty, which is why I cannot argue today." Or a junior will say that on behalf of a senior who's absent. There's no reason why a judge shouldn't say, "Sorry, that's not good enough."
Right.
But the number of times in which leeway is given to lawyers, and the more prominent the lawyer, the more the leeway, that's not a problem which is downstream of anything really. I think that's something that the judges have within themselves to change. And there's sometimes designated time limits for certain things which are regularly given, which are regularly exempted. Those kinds of things, I think that they could be stricter enforcement within the court system itself. But I think a lot of these pathologies come from the manner in which decisions upstream of the court system are taken in relation to policy, or the manner in which a contract is going to be litigated, etc.
Okay, so now let's get to the part where when you look at all of this, right, what's your diagnosis and what have you therefore set out to do?
Well, one of the things at TrustBridge that we are trying to do, one of the areas of our work, is looking at the regulatory state. Now, as you know, there's a large number of things that have shifted from the primary focus of the courts to regulators in the last 30 years.
Right.
And regulation is very interesting, or the regulatory space is an interesting one, because the idea that otherwise we hold very dear, which is the idea of separation of powers. So the legislature will make law, the government or the executive will implement it, and the courts will adjudicate on it. That idea of separation of powers is deliberately violated, if you like, within the remit of a regulator. A regulator will make regulation, a regulator will implement regulation, and a regulator will adjudicate on the same.
In India.
In India. And in many parts of the world, in the US, for example, they're trying to move away from that. But in many parts of the world, this is to some extent what happens. And the way that they deal with this in other parts of the world is you have a different body within the regulatory framework that adjudicates, which is not connected. So to some extent, we do as well. Yeah. So, for example, APTEL, which is the Appellate Tribunal for Electricity, will not make regulation, but they will adjudicate on what the electricity.
Just to make it more concrete, can you give, and you just started with this power example, right? Just make it can you just help people with an example?
So I think, so let's not look at the appellate stage, let's just look at electricity regulation within a state.
Right.
So the ERC, the Electricity Regulatory Commission of a state, and you can add whatever letter before of the state, or KERC is Karnataka, will make subordinate law, will make regulations on the basis of powers that have been given to it under the Electricity Act.
Right.
It will then be charged with implementing that regulation, and it will be doing that on a regular basis.
Give me an example of what regulation here would mean.
So, for example, the open access regulations. The open access regulations are made at the central level, but they're implemented at the state level.
Right.
So they could be regulations in relation to.
And open access regulations, again, just for the benefit of people who may not know the electricity sector, is people who are buying, quote unquote, off the grid, right? Not from the DISCOM.
Correct. So it's basically something. It's a permission that you get to use the network. One person gets to use the network to sell to a third party, which is not a distribution company owned by the state.
Right.
So very recent.
And how you do this is the regulation that is set up by the state electricity
Yeah.
regulator.
So I'll give you an example, which is a very recent one, which ran into certain problems. So it's quite interesting. The central government issued these draft green open access regulations, which were open access for renewable energy regulations. The state of Karnataka, the regulator in the state of Karnataka, adopted those regulations and said and enacted them, saying these are the regulations for the state of Karnataka. That was challenged in court, and the High Court of Karnataka said, sorry, you cannot do that because this is a power that has been given actually under the Electricity Act to the state regulator. And we do not see that you've applied your mind and adopted regulations through deliberation at the state level. You've just taken what the central government has given you. And, and while we think these regulations are great and they help bring more renewable energy into the grid, the manner in which you did it is against what the Electricity Act says. So the Karnataka regulator had to go through a deliberation and effectively adopt the same thing, but they had to go through a process to do it. So this is a situation in which the power to make regulation is that of the regulator.
Right.
So the regulator needs to make the regulation on open access for renewable energy within the state.
Right.
It will then implement that regulation. In other words, people will apply to it for green open access and it will give that approval or not. So that is its regulatory function. And then you may have a situation in which someone does not get green open access or they are denied it for some reason and they want to challenge it. And that challenge will go to the same regulator.
Okay.
That made the regulation, that implemented it, that looked at the application, denied it, they will. So technically it's another part of that regulator, but it's all happening within the same space.
Right.
So the reason that I started off talking about the separation of powers is that what makes looking at regulators very interesting is because this is what happens within a regulator.
Right.
And therefore, the manner in which you evaluate the performance of a regulator is somewhat different from the manner in which you evaluate how a court is functioning.
Sure.
So we said, okay.
Because all the upstream and downstream is right.
So you're basically a little microcosm, a universe in and of itself. So what we said is, okay, how do we look at how well a regulator is performing, given that there is this inherent conflict of interest through no fault of it, because this is the law has put it in itself, put the regulator into this situation through no fault of itself. This is what it has to deal with. So how do we look at the performance of a regulator? So one simple way to look at the performance of a regulator is how many of its decisions are being challenged. And next step, how many of its challenged decisions are being overturned or remanded to it for being sent back to it for reconsideration. So what we've set up is a research program which uses AI to study the regulatory orders and come up with metrics as to how a particular regulator is performing. We started with SEBI and insider trading orders. And the same, how many of these are being overturned at SAT. And we use the same principles, the same methodology for electricity regulators. We started with Tamil Nadu and then moving on to other states. And this methodology can be used to evaluate any regulator in the country.
Right.
And what we do as part of this work is not only do we do the analysis, but then we publish detailed manuals as to how this was done, so that if anyone else wants to study another regulator, they can look at that manual and use the same.
And how well is the analysis correlating with a general sense of how good or effective that regulator is or is not?
Very closely. I think, very closely. I think although, these things are highly relative and people don't necessarily have a sense of how well one state regulator is functioning vis-a-vis another unless you're highly embedded in that sector in a particular state. But I think there are different people study these things differently. So there are some slightly varying statistics, for example, on how well SEBI is functioning. But we found that the sense of market participants as to how SEBI, for instance, is performing is quite closely correlated to what our data is coming up with. But what the data does is it takes what is otherwise a rant or a living room conversation.
Right.
You can put hard numbers to it.
Right.
And then it gives you the scope to engage with the regulator and say, look, we want you to perform well. We're not here to just to criticize you. And you want to perform better. And the vast majority of people that we've come across don't want to be their decisions to be overturned or to be criticized. So we found a fairly high degree of openness to the kind of work that we've been doing, although our regulatory engagement is just at its very early stages.
Right. You were focusing more on the research side of it. Here's something that I've found, right? For instance, I don't know, you guys have looked at Tamil Nadu quite closely, right? And generally, institutions in Tamil Nadu tend to be better performing. Generally, I don't know. Is that also the case when it comes to electricity regulation?
No, it's not. And I think electricity is quite different from most areas of the economy because it is really deeply embedded in the political economy of every state. If I don't know if you know this, but power is free for agriculture in Tamil Nadu. And about 30 to 35% of consumption of electricity in the state is in the agricultural sector.
Right.
There's no metering. There is, let alone payment, there's no metering. So you can imagine that the manner in which a regulator will deal with free electricity and otherwise highly subsidized electricity for various other categories of the population, that there will be political considerations in the manner that it operates. And while you're right in saying that Tamil Nadu is administered generally quite well, you also know at the same time that there are lots of freebies in this case.
Yes.
And therefore, given that power is one of the main areas in which there are freebies, the functioning of the regulator is therefore affected by that.
Substantially.
Yeah, substantially.
Right. And
it's not necessarily done in a very overt way, but one very obvious way in which it's done is by not appointing a technical member, for example, or not, so that you sort of tie the hands of the regulator to come up with the best possible decision. And the staffing of these regulators is quite funny because very often the members of the regulator are on deputation from the distribution company.
Right.
Which is generally appearing before them very often. So you often have your boss in the regulatory.
So you take the conflict of interest further.
Conflicts are so deep that
I mean, you had no separation of powers, and now you have no.
It's there for everyone to see.
Yeah. So again, and like you said, you're trying to start the conversation by just showing the data on what the problem is here. What is the pathway that you see on all of this stuff? Like, are you start a conversation and you engage, but what is the route that leads to change?
I've been quite pleasantly surprised by the response of the 2 or 3 regulators that we've engaged with. One of the tools that we are proposing to them, which is a fairly non-controversial tool. And one of the things we go in and say, as I just said, is that we're not there to criticize, we're there to strengthen people's hands to help them improve the manner in which they're doing things. So one of the tools that we're proposing to them is very simple. It's a precedent checker. So what we're offering to do is to say, we'll take the universe of precedents that exist with respect to the 3 or 4 areas in which you adjudicate, or the main types of cases that come before you. And we will give you a precedent checker which can run as a small language model on your premises to give you pointers as to how you should decide a matter. And if your own decisions in the past have been in the opposite direction in which you're finding yourself inclined to go in a matter, then it gives you cause to stop and think. It will also tell you what the Supreme Court of India has said, which is the ultimate appellate body through APTEL, or Aptel has said on the same matter, so that you can then consider it and see whether the case in front of you is fitting the fact scenario. If you want to distinguish it on the facts, you can do it, but at least the guardrails, the parameters within which you should be taking your decision will be there for you to see. So that's step one. Step two would be from there is to say we can actually provide it now, but people are a little more cautious about it at the moment, and I understand why. But I suspect that once they see the precedent checker operating well, they'll be more inclined to consider that, which is an order writing tool.
Okay.
Which is a tool which will take the precedents and give you the first draft of an order, having put in the fact scenario, and leave open the space for the exercise of mind by the regulator as to how the facts and the precedents are working together on a specific matter. And you can do it either with the precedent checker or without. So at the very least, what an order writing tool could give you, if you want to sort of consider the two separately, is a well-structured order which doesn't have grammatical mistakes or errors of punctuation, which can lead to dispute.
Contains all the elements.
Contains all the elements which any reasonable person would say should be part of an order on that particular matter. And then you can look side by side, you can look at the precedent checker and say, okay, how are the two, what's the Venn diagram between the two, and how do I put that in? You'll get consistency of orders as well.
Fair.
So as you know, members of regulatory commissions change reasonably often, and you'll get a consistency of language. You'll probably get better habits that'll form for the secretariat of people who support the members.
Right.
So we think that's a sort of solution to a problem where there's no victim to the crime of doing that. So I suspect that over time, once people see that the precedent checker is working, that they might lend themselves to using the tool as well.
So both of these appear to me to be in the category of technological capacity addition.
They are, but what's sitting behind them is substantive research on the law, on law and on process. So if you need to consider four things, if for instance an insider trading order should have four elements in it, this will tell you whether your order contains those four elements or not. So it's looking at the substance. It's using technology to surface what the substantive elements of a particular order should be.
Got it. How would you even start approaching, or is that in your roadmap, the issue that you spoke about right at the beginning, right? Which is that a lot of all of the problems that we have are rooted in a mindset or cultural opposition to commercial activity rather than process or sort of, and I'm not, this is not a question to you as from a adversarial perspective. This is a question that I very often think about, right? Which is that in our systems, like you very rightly said, it's such mindset, deeply rooted mindsets that are at the cause of the problem. We are working very much downstream trying to tinker with other stuff. So I just wonder if you ever thought about it or thought about how do we move?
Well, I suspect you're asking that question for the same reason that, I'll give you an answer which probably matches your thinking about it often, which is that it's above my pay grade to some extent as to how to do it. But I feel that, and I'm not being someone who's really been a data evangelist so far or a tech evangelist, but my suspicion is that what you need to do is find examples of situations in which this kind of thought process is leading to negative outcomes, and to show it through data. And if you can, to propose a technologically based solution to solving that problem. I think there's a lot more openness to tech today. So if you were to dress up the solution to a problem in saying, here's a tech tool to do something, then I think the adoption is more likely to be higher than in a situation where you're just identifying the problem and saying we need to find the solution. So if you can provide a technological thing, which I don't think that's the way it should be, but if that's the game that one has to play today, I'm happy to play it.
Sure.
But I think that to identify through data that some of these problems exist and finding ways to show how tweaking a law can lead to a better outcome again through data, I think that's the way to go, because otherwise we are going back into the realm of theoretical conversation, ideology, philosophy, and that sort of thing. So I think that's important. It's also then over time it becomes harder to refute for anyone who holds a contrary view if the data builds up. So for instance, one of the things that we're trying to look at is around 2017, the customs came up with a guideline, internal guideline, to say that any case where the matter in question was more than 15,000 rupees, I think it was 15,000, but the sum doesn't matter so much, relatively low amount. The matter under dispute is 15,000 rupees, and if we lose the matter at first instance, we will not appeal. So what's happened there is you've taken through a guideline which an officer can implement without fear. You have actually made the process a lot more efficient, because the amount of money you'd spend appealing that matter would be far more than 15,000 rupees. So you've taken so what I'd like to see through when we will be beginning to study that is what has been the impact on the disputes within customs since that happened. So look at the data of pre and post and to say what conclusions can we draw of having a tool like this which allows an officer to take a decision without the fears that normally accompany such a decision. So if you could this is just a hard line in the sand, but instead a slightly more sophisticated version of this could be ask these 3 or 4 questions before you appeal.
Right.
So, and if and it shows are relatively binary answers, then again the officer's hands could be strengthened to take a decision that would be more efficient for everyone concerned.
This is particularly interesting because we are facing this deregulation moment, right? Like the FM has announced deregulation, the Prime Minister brought it up, right? There is a high-level committee being set up. And I'm not sure that people are necessarily looking at it from the implementation side of things, right? Which is to say, are there guidelines to just ignore? What is the kind of data out there that you think would be worthwhile looking at?
I'm not sure what framework the Deregulation Commission or this whole process is taking. What is it? I think that just the fact that it's happening is a good thing. I don't expect it to happen in the most efficient or the best way possible. I expect it to happen, if it happens with 50% effectiveness, we'll have done really, really well. But if you're 20% better, I'll settle for that. So I just hope that what this does is opens up avenues for people like us to make these kinds of arguments to people who are now charged with looking at deregulation top down. So I think the top down, what we're doing is bottom up,
right.
and there are people who are looking at it top down. We'll have to find places where our minds meet somewhere,
right?
And hopefully that will happen through examples of this kind, where if we do put out sufficient amounts of data, then people will be able to say, okay, this is a area in which we feel that action will be relatively easy to take. And what we try and do in our work is to look at areas where we feel that the political economy is not insurmountable, is not very difficult. Put aside power for a moment, because it is very difficult there.
Yeah.
But in other areas, it may not be, where it's not so hard. There, where we can look at, where we think that the kinds of people who should be looking at this from the Deregulation Commission perspective should be interested in the sort of work we're doing, where I think it would potentially be low-hanging fruit for them.
What are your sort of top 3 low-hanging fruit or high-impact impact spaces?
Oh, I hate those sorts of questions because I don't think of these things in terms of lists. When my kids, for example, ask me, what's your favorite this, I really don't have an answer because on one day it might be one thing, one day it might be another. But I think what's decriminalization of law is it's what we've done so far is really a drop in the
I
ocean.
mean, the original report said 26,000 and they've done away with 200. So
Yeah, I don't think that if you were to ask someone today to make these laws afresh, and if we didn't have the history of having this sort of default penal clause in almost every legislation that we've got, I don't think that the people making the law would want to put it there.
sure.
I don't think there's a desire to have a penal consequence. I think this is a very much a legacy issue, but it's also a non-application of mind issue. People are not thinking through what are the consequences on the minds of people who are going to enter into business of a clause like this. So what the clause like this does, it frightens away people who want to do business honestly, and it encourages people who are willing to manage their environment.
Right.
Because it says, oh, there's a penal consequence here. I'll pay off the guy who's going to, come and inspect such and such.
Right.
As opposed to the person who's going to do things honestly. So, gosh, even for this small thing, I could be hauled up. Better not get into it.
But I've heard from people that one reason why they like this stuff in there, you're saying that maybe they won't do it now, is they just don't have the capacity to enforce, right? So if they use the threat of a penal clause to say, okay, this is how I will get people to follow my instructions, which again I think comes from this mindset of you have to control what's going on and protect other people.
But I'd say then,
Consequences.
if it's an empty threat, then why should the empty threat of a penalty, a financial penalty, be worse than the empty threat of imprisonment? I would say increase the financial penalty, make the financial penalties significantly higher, and enforce them selectively if you can. Enforce them to the extent that you enforce the criminal penalties today, and that should be. I think you need to do a little bit of deterrent studies.
Right.
So, for instance, I'm someone who's quite fundamentally opposed to the death penalty. And one of the reasons that I'm opposed to it is does not do what it said supposed to do. It is not a deterrent.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, this is that classic finding, right? Severity of punishment doesn't matter as much as probability of
enforcement. So I think if you, I think there's this knee-jerk thought or knee-jerk reaction that if we can't implement, then the threat of jail is still going to be greater. But I don't think that works.
right.
I think someone will need to study that find a way to actually evaluate how people will respond to a higher financial penalty versus the threat of imprisonment.
I guess this is some kind of forced helplessness on the Indian system, right? Where they know that the probability of enforcement is a much tougher and much more important thing, but they don't have any way of affecting it. But there's a performative element to a severity of punishment that they can just write down a different number or put in a criminalization.
Well, let's take an analogy with traffic fines. Why is it that we don't put people in jail for jumping at a red light?
Right.
We used to have a low fine. We've increased the fine. I don't know what that's done to jumping of traffic lights. It's probably because it's not enforced. But I think if we said we'll put people in jail for that, we'd either have overflowing jails or non-enforcement, or a bribe being paid on the spot in order to avoid the thing being enforced.
And as a being somebody on the road, I'll tell you what does make a difference is a camera on the traffic light, which is going to catch you every single time you.
Absolutely, and my driver knows where the cameras are, and he slows down automatically.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
so I think I think maybe what we can take away from this is that we need to bring in a bit of behavioral science into this, and in a realistic fashion, looking at an environment where state capacity to enforce is low.
Yeah.
Then what are the behavioral tools that will make people follow the law more? And it may be that for certain kinds of things we need to keep criminal consequences. But you can't, for instance, have criminal consequences for the director of a company for sacks of wheat not being stored properly in a warehouse.
right. Yeah.
It just does not make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Switching away from this a little bit to another topic that you've written about, right, which is reforms in the power sector. It's similar, related. He's spoken about the regulatory side of it a lot, but you have a really nice paper with Ajay Shah on just the overall re-engineering needed. So just want you to take us through that.
Well, what we were doing in that paper was marrying my experience, practical lived experience of working in the power sector and the kinds of problems that was encountered as an advisor to investors and people who are providing finance, with the theoretical ideas of markets and market failure. So I sort of tend to ask a few fairly, try and make the question sound naive, because I feel that sometimes you have to really bring it down to a very basic level, so that which will encourage people to evaluate their actions in the consequence of a bigger picture. So one question that I like to ask is, we want to be at net zero by 2070. What is anyone's view of what our power sector looks like in 2070? Is it a power sector that is still largely dominated by the government and the state in various different forms? Or is it one that is largely private? Now, 2070 is too far away, but if you have a goal, a vision, then you can plan what the steps might be and how you get there. What is the more effective way to get there? And what we feel, and I don't think too many people disagree with us, is that ultimately the objective is to have a largely market-based power sector. And we already are beginning to see the opportunities that exist for people to be transacting with each other without the intermediation of the state in one way or the shape or form. So what that boils down to is to say, okay, we need to look at regulation in the whole power sector from the perspective of market failure. So what we want to do is have the sector run on market principles, which doesn't just mean, as most people think today, is that more power should be traded through the electricity exchanges, which it should, but that's not the only thing we're talking about. What we are saying is, if there's any transaction that anyone wants to do with someone else in the economy that involves the purchase or sale of power or any ancillary services around power, then the only question we should be asking to regulate that transaction is, what market failure is it causing? And to regulate for that market failure. So if you're my next door neighbor and you've put a solar panel and you have excess capacity and you want to sell that power to me, you want to run a cable safely without causing fire, so you have to follow safety guidelines, to my house and supply me power and sell power to me at 100 rupees a unit, why should that be anyone else's problem? We are two, individuals with knowledge of the market. If I'm choosing to buy and sell, if you had an apple tree in your garden and you wanted to sell me your excess apples, nobody would bother about that. They just charge GST on that transaction. So my point is to say, why should it not be the same for power from a principle perspective? And in fact, we have a whole bunch of states now trying to enact peer-to-peer power sales guidelines, which allow these peer-to-peer sales. I could sell you power from the battery of my car, which I've charged through the solar panel on my roof. Now, at the moment, it is highly questionable whether these transactions are legal. Most of them are not legal. So again, going back to what we started off talking about is, don't prevent something from happening. Ask after the fact whether that was all right or not. I would say that we should say that any transaction that anyone could conceive of should be permitted, unless it is causing market failure. In the power sector, the main market failure that you think of is anti-competitive behavior, because a lot of what happens in the power sector is done by large companies. There's also a single transmission line coming to your house. Not multiple people can't use it. So until such time when we have retail sales of power, etc., you have to regulate the price of power. Because you only get, it is inherently monopolistic. So that's one of the main areas. The other area is in relation to standards, where you have, the right standards uh, for in terms of frequencies, in terms of load bearing, etc. Grid management is another.
Right.
So you identify the main market failures that exist and you regulate severely for them. Have very strong guidelines, have very strong regulators. Uh, I would say that is the nucleus of the solution that we're proposing. A lot of the things around that are less essential, if you like. For instance, the whole idea that distribution companies should be privatized is a good to have. It will help the system perform better, but it's not absolutely essential. You can see markets functioning well in the power sector in an environment where you still have distribution companies, provided you don't have to transact with the distribution companies, and provided the distribution companies are not a bottleneck to these transactions happening, which today they are.
Right.
And they are, because very often it's an existential issue for them. Because the people who want to migrate out of the government network are the people who are paying the highest rates of electricity because of the differentiated tariffs.
Industrial guys, commercial industrial, right?
So that's the sort of basis of what we're proposing. And what that says is that when you're looking at whether it's legislation, whether it's regulation, whether it is business models, whatever it is in the sector, keep those ideas in mind, and things that promote that kind of vision should be favored over things that don't. Because what we have to do at the moment, and the other point is that the way that our system is designed at the moment is that business activity in the power sector is permitted provided there is a framework to do it. There is so much development and growth and technological change that's taking place that it's very difficult for the pace of regulation to keep up with the pace of change of both technology and business models and contracting that follows the business models.
Right.
So what's happening is today, for instance, storage is a new technology. You can only starting businesses in storage if there are storage guidelines, and you have to put in storage guidelines. If you then want to do storage coupled with generation, there's another set of guidelines that need to come up with that. Tomorrow, if there is a new type of technology, take small modular reactors, nuclear reactors,
Right.
you will need another set of regulations for that. So instead, we need to start regulating by principle.
Right.
And we should be able to ensure that most technologies that we can think of, and most business models that people could come up with, will fall within the remit of our regulatory framework if we regulate with those principles in mind.
Right. I think this is a recurring theme, right? That the issue is that we treat these principles of markets and commercial transactions as being forbidden until permitted, rather than permitted until something is wrong, is sort of a fundamental shift that we need. And I think, like, you're talking about the power sector and regulated sectors, but this is true across the board, right? I think in India. And again, I think I come back to both in policy making and in regulation, right? This just seems to be a very clear need. And you earlier said, when I asked you this question of, okay, how do we know how much of it is specific to India versus others? You pointed out the US, which I think set up on many of these principles and many of these market-friendly approaches, and is one of the better performing countries in the world. And I think for us to be one of the better performing countries in the world is definitely a shift that we need.
I think if we want to be a hub of innovation, you need to give people the space to innovate. So coming back to something that I know a bit about, on the demand side in the power sector, there's absolutely no innovation at all, because there's very little that you can do on the demand side,
Right.
which can make money for a private person.
Right.
It can save money for individuals if you get a more energy efficient device, for instance.
Right.
But there are no aggregated business models that can genuinely be done at scale where anyone is willing to put in any effort. And this, we're leaving a lot on the table there.
Right. And in particular, and this is, I think, on the climate side, right? Like people often, like you said, you started with this whole idea that if you have to go to net zero, how do we get there? Innovation is going to be one of the main ways it happens, right? And if you don't have a price system, if you don't have a market system that encourages people to innovate, where will the innovation come from?
No, I agree completely.
Yeah.
It's a huge. It's not, and we already have examples of innovation in places where the space to innovate exists. So if you were to look at a power purchase agreement between SECI, the Solar Energy Corporation of India, which is one of the main procuring bodies of the government of India, and a private party as part of a bid process. And if you were to compare it to the kinds of PPAs that are being signed today, for example, just to take two names between a Google data center and a Renew Power, and you look at the sophistication of those PPAs and the kinds of clauses that are going into them, because it's two, free individuals contracting with each other.
Right.
You look at the innovation that's taking place within that contract, you won't recognize the two documents next to each other.
Right. And that's the kind of thing you need to solve for renewable power, right? Like, I mean, renewable power has fantastic promise, but it has its own problems. You mentioned some of them, right? The intermittency, of course, the grid management aspect of it, right? And that's actually one of the things that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about is one principle, which is this monopolistic style issue that power has, which could be solved by more open access, more peer-to-peer, that militates against the grid management aspects, right? Because grid management becomes substantially more complex, sort of the more people you have. How do these things balance out?
I think that, it will become more complex, but so what?
Yeah.
I think we've got more and more tools to deal with complexity.
Right.
You can also think of some fail safes.
Right.
So, for example, in some countries, what you've got is a couple of power plants that are paid to sit idle.
Right.
And if there is an issue, they will be turned on.
Right.
And the whole system pays for the cost of that.
Right.
But what those plants are doing is they're allowing the rest of the system to function on more market principles.
Right.
So in Ireland, for example, you've got something like
And
this.
overall, you end up saving money.
And definitely,
Huge.
yeah. So I think that if you start off by saying that it's too hard to do, so we shouldn't do it, then you won't do it.
Right.
If you start off by saying we have to do it,
Right.
then little by little you will solve the problems that are making it hard for you to do. It's really a mindset approach. So I found when I started doing policy work in the power sector a little more deeply, or a little more, joined up kind of fashion, as opposed to just responding to one policy document, or which is the sort of thing one used to do earlier. I found that many people who are very reform oriented in the sector are still really under almost Stockholm syndrome of the fact that the only way we can change things in the power sector is through incremental institutional change, and not through looking at ways in which we can bring in markets. So it's not their priority. So if you change your priority to say, we have to have the power sector functioning on market principles, what can we do for that to happen? You will find a whole new set of opportunities opening up, as opposed to saying, how do we get the power exchange to be trading at 15% power instead of 10% power?
I think this is a style of thinking that we could adopt way beyond just the power sector.
No, I agree, but it's where I see it working on a day-to-day basis. But I find it quite remarkable that anyone who is a reformer in the sector is just looking at reform in a sort of straight line, as opposed to in terms of paradigm shifts.
And I think, again, like, I reiterate, I think this is really important across sectors. And I think, like, one of the pathologies that the power sector suffers from is free power, right? A lot of the problems we have is because of the insistence in operating in a non-market system, right?
Yeah.
That we've locked in welfare into the system.
I think that's the way to put it. I have no problem with welfare.
Right.
I think it's the government's prerogative to do as much welfare as it wants.
Right.
It just cannot make the power sector pay for it.
Right.
This has to come out of the coffers of the state.
Yeah.
So you want someone to have free power, give them the money to pay for the power, or tell someone coming into the system that you will factor into your cost of power the fact that you will be giving X number of units away for free. Someone has to pay for the power that is generated. Someone has to pay for it. If it is not going to be the individual out of their pocket, it will have to be the individual through the taxes that they pay to the state that are then given as welfare.
Exactly.
But it can't be. It sort of can't come out of nowhere. I was at a party in Delhi, a very sophisticated set of people a couple of months ago, where highly educated, very reform-oriented, market-thinking people in every other area of life felt very strongly that power should be free, not just for the people who it's already free, but free for everyone. I mean, I was just flabbergasted, and I opened my mouth to reply and just said, no, there's no point, because there's this sense that it's a public good, just like the road. Because people are used to paying for water; they have a water bill, but if you think of it as a road, that the road is there.
But we pay for it.
You pay for.
Pay
People
for
don't think
roads.
of how.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But so that's why I thought it was a fairly shallow kind of.
And again, I think this goes back to the discussion we were having before the camera switched on, right? Which is people don't think of how markets add value. Like, what do they do for us, right? Which is to allow us to judge how much of something we need and what we are willing to pay in exchange. And when something's free, we don't value it, and so no one produces it. Anyway, fantastic conversation, Akshay. I think for me, again, these ideas of the fundamental mindset that we have in terms of things that are just forbidden, right? And the view that we take towards commercial activity of clamping down on it was, I think it's a really big issue, and collectively we should think more about what we can do on it. And the other one, right, that in sector after sector, we require a paradigm shift of doing welfare for welfare's sake and letting markets operate for the sake of markets. These are two big ideas, and of course, lots of really interesting stuff. Thank you for joining us.
Not at all. My pleasure.